My name is Clara Whitfield, and for 34 years, I was the daughter this family refused to claim. They said I wasn't real, that I was a mistake my father made before he met the woman who mattered. They cut me out of the will. They cut me out of the funeral. They cut me out of 34 years of birthday tables and Christmas dinners, and they handed everything, the house, the savings, the land, to the son who stood at that graveside like he owned it. His name was Richard Ashworth, the golden son, the chosen one. Except, 2 months ago, a DNA test didn't just prove that I was real. It proved that Richard wasn't. He'd been adopted at birth. A private arrangement, arranged quietly, never spoken about. He had no idea. Neither did I. And the family that spent 3 decades calling me a liar had spent those same 3 decades protecting a secret that was 10 times bigger than mine. What happened when those results landed on a solicitor's desk is something none of them saw coming. Welcome to hidden family drama, where the people buried by their own families tend to have the most interesting things to say. Stay with me. This one goes deep. I'll start where it actually begins, which is not with a DNA test or a solicitor's letter, but with a woman named Margaret Harlow sitting across from a man named James Ashworth in a cafe in Bristol in the summer of 1989. Margaret was 23. James was 31. He was charming, well-dressed, and as she would only discover later, already engaged to someone else. That someone else was Diane Pemberton, the woman who would become Diane Ashworth, the woman who would later spend the better part of 3 decades making my mother's life, and eventually mine, feel like an inconvenience that refused to disappear. By the time my mother realized James was not the man he'd presented himself to be, she was already pregnant. He didn't deny it. He didn't disappear, either. What he did was worse than both of those things. He offered her money to go away quietly, and when she refused, he married Diane anyway, moved 40 miles north to a comfortable detached house in Cheshire, and simply pretended my mother didn't exist. I was born in March of 1990. My birth certificate said James Ashworth as my father. My mother kept it. She filed it. She did everything right, because she believed, the way young women in impossible situations often believe, that doing everything right would eventually matter. It took me 20 years to understand that it matters, just not always in the timeline you expect. Growing up, I knew fragments of the story. My mother didn't hide it from me, but she was careful with the words she chose. She'd say things like, he has another family, or it's complicated, and I was old enough to read the space between those sentences even if I was too young to fill it in properly. What I knew, concretely, was this. My father was a man named James Ashworth. He lived in Cheshire. He had a wife and a son named Richard who was 2 years older than me. He had a house and a business and a life that had no visible room for me in it. I wrote him a letter when I was 16. A proper letter, on lined paper, carefully worded. I told him I wasn't asking for money or a relationship. I just wanted to know if he was willing to acknowledge me, to say the word daughter out loud, even once. He didn't reply. His wife did. Diane Ashworth wrote back on cream stationery with her initials embossed at the top. I've kept the letter. I'll keep it until I die. It said, in the careful language of a woman who'd clearly spent time choosing every word, that James had no legal or moral obligation to acknowledge any claim made by individuals outside the family unit, and that further contact would be referred to their solicitor. Individuals outside the family unit. I was 16 years old, reading my own father's wife telling me I was not a person, but a legal threat. I put the letter in a drawer. I put the drawer in the back of my mind. I went to university, studied law, which I recognize in retrospect was not a coincidence, and I got very good at understanding exactly what people like Diane Ashworth meant when they used language like that. James Ashworth died in January of 2023. He was 64 years old. A heart attack, apparently. Quick. He didn't suffer. I found out from a cousin on my mother's side who'd seen the death notice in the local paper. Not from the family. Not from a call. Not from a letter on cream stationery. From a death notice. I wasn't invited to the funeral. I didn't go. But I'll tell you what I did do. I rang a solicitor. James Ashworth's estate was substantial. Not generational wealth, not aristocratic money, but the comfortable, accumulated kind that a man builds over 40 years of running a mid-sized logistics company in the north of England. The house in Cheshire, a 4-bedroom detached with a converted garage, was valued at just over £620,000. There was a pension pot. There were savings. There was a minority stake in a small industrial unit he'd co-owned with a business partner. In total, the estate was worth somewhere in the region of £1.1 million. The will left everything to Diane and Richard. I was not mentioned, not to be excluded, not by name at all, simply absent, as though 34 years of existing had produced no legal trace worth acknowledging. My solicitor, a very composed woman named Fiona, who I chose specifically because she has the calm energy of someone who has seen every possible variety of human terrible behavior and is no longer surprised by any of it, explained my options clearly. Under the Inheritance, Provision for Family and Dependents Act 1975, an illegitimate child of a deceased person has the right to bring a claim against the estate if reasonable financial provision has not been made for them. The biological relationship, she explained, would need to be established. That's where the DNA test came in. I wasn't doing it to surprise anyone. I wasn't doing it for drama. I was doing it because Fiona told me it was the first, necessary procedural step. A legal requirement before anything else could move. I sent off the test. I registered with a reputable genealogy platform as well, because Fiona said the more documentation the better. The results came back in 11 days. They confirmed what my birth certificate and my mother's testimony had always said. James Ashworth was my biological father. The match was conclusive, irrefutable, the kind of number, 99.998% probability, that even the most expensive barrister in England cannot argue with in front of a judge. I was his daughter. What I did not expect was the second notification. The genealogy platform I'd registered with sends you matches. Other users who share DNA. Cousins, second cousins, sometimes closer. 3 weeks after my results came back, I got a match notification. The profile had a first name, Marcus, a short bio, a handful of family surnames, and a shared DNA percentage that the platform flagged automatically as close family. Likely first-degree relative. First-degree relative means parent, child, or sibling. I didn't have siblings. My mother was an only child. My father, James, had no siblings who'd had children, according to what little public information existed. I messaged Marcus. He replied within an hour. He was 36 years old. He lived in Manchester. He'd been adopted at birth through a private arrangement, and he'd been registered, legally and socially, under the surname Ashworth his entire life. His full name was Richard Marcus Ashworth. Richard, James and Diane's son. The golden son. The one who'd stood at that graveside. The one who'd inherited everything. He had no idea. I want to be careful here about how I describe what came next because Richard Ashworth is, in every meaningful sense, also a victim of this story. He did not know he was adopted. He did not know his parents had kept it from him for 36 years. He had built his entire identity, his entire sense of family, on a foundation that had been quietly laid on sand. When I called him, we agreed to speak on the phone after a few messages back and forth. His voice was the voice of a man standing at the edge of something he couldn't quite see the bottom of. He kept saying, "This doesn't make sense." I kept saying, "I know. I'm sorry. But the numbers don't lie." We talked for 2 hours. I told him my story. He told me his. He said his parents, James and Diane, had always presented themselves as a perfectly matched, perfectly natural family. No cracks, no conversations about fertility struggles, no hint. Nothing. He said the only odd thing he could ever remember was that his mother would sometimes deflect conversations about resemblance. When relatives said, "Oh, Richard looks just like James," Diane would change the subject. He'd always put it down to her being modest. By the end of that call, we both understood what it actually meant. Fiona's face, when I brought both sets of DNA results to our next meeting, was the most controlled expression of absolute professional astonishment I have ever seen on a human being. She read the documents. She read them again. She set them down on her desk with the precise care of someone placing something fragile. Then she said, right then, This changes things considerably. Here's what it meant legally. Richard Ashworth was not the biological son of James Ashworth. He was adopted, informally, privately, in a way that had never been fully formalized through proper legal channels, as it later emerged. Which meant his status as a legal heir was complicated, to put it as gently as Fiona put it. I was the biological daughter of James Ashworth. Documented. Tested. Proven. Under the 1975 Act, I had a legitimate claim for reasonable financial provision. And with Richard's legal standing now under scrutiny, the original will was going to face some very serious questions. Fiona sent the formal notification to Diane Ashworth's solicitors in early May. Diane's response came back in less than 48 hours. It was, Fiona told me later with the ghost of a smile, one of the more energetically worded letters she had received in 20 years of practice. Diane denied everything. She disputed the DNA results. She disputed my mother's account. She threatened counterclaims. She used the phrase malicious fabrication in reference to a scientific test conducted by an accredited laboratory. She also, in what I can only describe as a tactical error of significant proportions, made no mention of Richard's adoption. She was still trying to hold the original story together. Even then, even with the results in front of her. That was the moment I understood how deeply a person can commit to a version of events when the alternative is admitting that you've been living a lie for 36 years. Richard asked to meet Diane himself before the legal proceedings went any further. He drove to Cheshire on a Tuesday morning in late May. He told me about it afterwards on the phone, in the flat and careful voice of someone who has just come through something and hasn't fully processed it yet. He sat in the kitchen of the house he grew up in. The house he'd always assumed would one day be partly his. And he asked his mother, the woman who'd raised him, packed his school lunches, sat in the front row at his graduation, to tell him the truth. She held out for about 20 minutes. Then she told him there had been a pregnancy, Diane's, early in their marriage, a miscarriage at 14 weeks, then another, then a third. James hadn't wanted to pursue adoption through official channels, too public, too much scrutiny, too many questions from people whose opinions he cared about. So, a private arrangement was made through a contact of a contact. An infant, born to a young woman who couldn't keep him, placed quietly with a family who wanted him desperately. Richard. Diane said she loved him. She said she'd always loved him. She said the adoption made him no less her son. Richard said he believed her. But he also said, and I think this is the line that will stay with me longest, that the love being real didn't make the secret acceptable. That you could love someone completely and still have robbed them of the right to know who they were. He came out of that kitchen with the confirmation. He came out knowing that his entire legal standing in relation to his father's estate was now an open question. And he came out having made a decision that I did not expect. He rang Fiona's office that afternoon and told her he would not contest my claim. What followed was several months of legal process that I will spare you in detail, because legal process, even satisfying legal process, is not the part of this story that matters. What matters is this. The estate was ultimately divided. My claim was settled. I received a portion, not half, not everything, but a real and meaningful acknowledgement that I existed, that I was owed something, and that a court of law in England agreed. Diane did not speak to me directly at any point during the proceedings. She communicated through solicitors, through formal letters, through the careful, expensive language of a woman determined to manage the collapse of her story with as much dignity as she could preserve. I don't hate her for it. I've thought about this carefully, and I genuinely don't. She was a woman who had built her life around a particular version of events, and watching that version come apart publicly was its own kind of punishment. I didn't need to add to it. Richard and I are in contact. We're not close. We are, when all is said and done, two strangers who share a biological father and a very strange few months of our lives. But we message occasionally. He came to my birthday dinner in the autumn, which was the first birthday in 34 years that any Ashworth attended. He brought a card. It said "Happy Birthday, Clara" on the front, in his handwriting. That's not a dramatic ending. It's not gold shovels on a hillside or a standing ovation at a ribbon cutting. It's just a card. But I'm 34 years old, and I have never once in my life received a birthday card from anyone on my father's side of the family. Sometimes the thing you've been waiting for arrives very quietly. My grandmother used to say the truth doesn't shout. It just waits. I didn't understand that when I was 16, writing a letter to a man who wouldn't reply. I understand it now. The truth waited. In a laboratory result. In a genealogy match. In the quiet of a phone call between two people who both deserved better from the same family. And when it finally spoke, it didn't need to raise its voice. If this story reminded you to keep your documents, know your rights, and never let anyone tell you that you aren't real enough to matter, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment below, and tell me where you're watching from. Hit subscribe so the algorithm stops burying these. And I'll see you in the next one.